the entire webinar. So if you need to step away or if you're joining late, you will receive a recording after the end of the webinar, together with an email that includes resources shared in the webinar itself. So a warm welcome to everyone who's been able to join. Very wonderful to see the numbers increasing as people continue to log in. Just a note before I introduce the panelist, for everyone to feel welcome to introduce yourself in the chat box. We always like to see who's on the call, where you are, what you do, knowing, of course, that this webinar was advertised through both the education and the child protection network spaces. So I'm hoping that we have a really nice mix of people. In addition to sharing your introduction on the chat box, I would welcome everyone to, as questions come up, as you listen to the presentations, please add your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom link. And if you have problems accessing that for whatever reason, you can add it to the chat box as well. We welcome any and all questions, and hopefully we'll have the time to answer at least a few of them after the presentations. But without further ado, let's jump into the webinar. Again, a very warm welcome. Before we get into the actual presentations, I want to acknowledge that we can't talk about supporting education during conflict without talking about protection, and it's really important and wonderful to see the growing interest in collaborating across sectors to ensure that we are providing the best support possible. We know that conflict increases and creates new risks and vulnerabilities. We know that the impact of conflict is not experienced equally. And our panelists will lift up some of the data that shows what we know is happening, as well as talking through the approaches and interventions to address and ensure that we are responding in the most responsible way possible to protect learners, educators, and the systems that are meant to support them. Throughout the conversation, I would just remind us that as we listen to numbers, we know that numbers represent individuals. We know that numbers represent children. We know that numbers represent teachers. We know that numbers represent schools. And all of that, behind all of that, is the hope of communities, of individual children to engage in and benefit from the best quality education possible, and the implications of not having access to that or having disruptions during conflict. So we are joined today. This is an unusual event in that it is co-hosted by all three agencies and networks. First, we have GCPEA, and Ilaria Palazzi and Felicity Pierce will be taking us through the highlights of the very recently released Education Under Attack report that was launched last week. ICRC will be represented by Mark Chappell, the head of education, who will be talking about ICRC's approach to protecting and ensuring access to education. And then the final presenter will be Dean Brooks, the director of INEE, the Interagency Network for Education, who will be speaking about the collaboration with our sister network, the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, and the joint initiative that we are supporting to look at protecting education in all that means during times of crisis, but specifically for this conversation during conflict. So without further ado, I will pass it over to GCPEA, Ilaria and Felicity. Please, we're looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today and collaborate around this webinar. As you said, I'm here today together with my colleague Felicity, and we are going to both share a few key findings from the report that the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack publishes every 2 years. As some of you may know, GCPEA is a global coalition of international organizations working globally, advocating for the protection of education during armed conflict. The coalition was created in 2010, and since then we have been, on one hand, monitoring and reporting, researching attacks on education at global scale, and on the other hand, use this research and evidence to try to convince states and other parties, to conflict, to seize attacks, and prevent, attacks from happening everywhere. So as I mentioned, every 2 years, GCPEA publishes its flagship report that it's called Education Under Attack. And we are happy to share that the 7th edition of this report that covers the period of 2022 and 2023 was just launched last week, and so we are really now trying to disseminate the findings, to seize every opportunity to discuss with partners and duty bearers about how we can work together towards improving the situation and protecting education in armed conflict. Just before passing the floor to my colleague Felicity, who will give you a snapshot on the key findings of the report, I just want to mention that GCPEA considers that an attack on education is any threatened or actual use of force against rights holders, including students, but also education personnel, as well as schools, universities, and any other education facilities. So it's a very broad scope when we talk about attacks, and it's also we cover and monitor intentional as well as indiscriminate attacks perpetrated by all sorts of groups, including armed forces, law enforcement, state security entities, as well as non-state armed groups. I will stop here and please pass the floor to my colleague Felicity.
Thanks, Ilaria. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a researcher at the Coalition, and so I'm going to go through some of the key findings in Education Under Attack 2024 and some of the key trends. I'll start quickly by the two big ones. So firstly, to say that, as we're probably all aware, attacks on education are shockingly common and also increasing. In the reporting period, as Ilaria mentioned, 2022 and 2023, we found an average of 8 attacks per day. I also wanted to highlight the impact of attacks, which we go into in the report, in the short term and the long term. So we know that attacks can kill and injure students and educators, and also damage or destroy schools and universities. And this can have long-lasting consequences where students don't resume studies for weeks, sometimes years, and sometimes they never return to the classroom. We also find that girl students and those with disabilities are particularly and uniquely impacted by these attacks, as well as the future economic and social development of the communities where they happen. So into the report. This edition of the report covers profiles 28 countries, all of which are affected by conflict and all of which experienced at least 10 attacks in the reporting period. We compile reports of attacks from media sources, UN agencies, human rights organizations, and humanitarian organizations, among others. So here we are looking now at attacks on schools, but I'll go back first to do the global count. So we identified around 6,000 reported attacks overall, including in cases of military use of schools and universities. This was an increase of nearly 20% compared to the 2 previous years that were reported in the previous education under attack. We also found more than 10,000 students and educators that were reportedly killed, injured, abducted, arrested, or otherwise harmed by attacks on education. And this was also an increase. It was an increase of at least 10% compared to the previous 2-year period. We found that the highest numbers of attacks on education were recorded in Palestine, Ukraine, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Myanmar. And we also saw that India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan had very high reported numbers of people harmed or killed in attacks on education. So the graph that you see now on the screen is attacks on schools. This was the most prevalent form of attack in the 2-year reporting period. It made up over half of all reported incidents, so over 2,000. And these attacks occurred in 27 of the 28 profiled countries. Attacks on schools include airstrikes, shelling, arson, looting, and threats, and caused the death and injury of over 725 students or educators, as well as damage and destruction of hundreds of school facilities. Ukraine and Palestine saw the highest numbers of attacks on schools, followed by Burkina Faso, DRC, and Myanmar. For instance, in Ukraine, we saw around 700 attacks on schools, most involving explosive weapons and many occurring in the south and east of the country. For example, shelling damaged a boarding school that was serving around 250 blind students in Kharkiv in March 2022. In Palestine, also, GCPEA identified at least 640 attacks on schools and interferences to education. Between October and December 2023, the UN reported that at least 352 schools were damaged in the Gaza Strip, and attacks continued into 2024, impacting over 80% of schools by April of this year. The next attack type I'll go into is attacks on schools, students, teachers, and other education personnel. We collected around 800 reports of this type of attack, which killed, injured, or otherwise harmed around 5,000 students or educators, where 1,000 were killed or injured or abducted, and we saw 4,000 that were reportedly arrested or detained. Moving on to military use. So again, it's an increasing trend. We see now the occupation of educational facilities.
Sorry to interrupt. Could someone tell me what to show? Because I don't know what you're following and what the audience is following.
When I started on military use, it was on the right slide. I don't know if I can adjust the slide from where I am.
No, because we're screen sharing.
Okay.
So
Okay, then
is this
back
the right
one? No, back one. That one. Yeah, military use. Thank you. Exactly. So with military use, as you can see, pretty widespread again, affecting most of the profiled countries. And we had over 1,000 reported incidents. And I would like to highlight that military use is particularly detrimental and complex, because if a school is partially occupied, then the students are put at risk of recruitment and of sexual violence, and they're also exposed to weapons and munitions if the school is also operating at the same time. And we also see in the report incidents where schools that are occupied by one party to a conflict are subsequently targeted in attacks by another party, which can have more long-lasting impacts as well. And these reports of military use were most prevalent in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Nigeria. And by military use, we mean when schools are occupied by armed forces or non-state armed groups for use as a base or barracks or to store weapons, among others. There are others. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. Next, we look at sexual violence and child recruitment. So from the map, you can see we identified reports of sexual violence that occurred at or on the way to or from school by parties to conflict in 7 countries. These were Cameroon, Colombia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Niger, South Sudan, Sudan, and Yemen. And we have an example in Sudan in May 2023. Alleged armed group fighters raided a dormitory for teaching staff at the Ahfad University for Women and took 2 women from the dormitory, and they were raped. And child recruitment also occurring at or on the way to or from school happened in 5 countries in the reporting period. Again, Colombia, DRC, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. As an example, in Colombia, at least 2 indigenous students were recruited on their way to school in Cauca department in March 2022. And there were also reports that fear of recruitment kept some parents from sending their children to school in several areas in the country during the reporting period. Next slide, please. Thank you. And lastly, we have higher education, which we identified over 360 reported incidents of attacks on higher education, 100 on facilities, and around 260 on university students and staff. For instance, in Afghanistan in 2022, we identified reports in which at least 39 students were reportedly injured and at least 98 students and staff were reportedly abducted or arrested during protest incidents. I'll go in now quickly to a few key trends. As we can see in the picture, that's one of them. So one of the alarming and increasing trends is the widespread use of explosive weapons used in attacks on education. We saw explosive weapons used in around 1/3 of all the reported attacks on education, so around 2,000, including airstrikes, rockets, artillery shelling, as well as the use of improvised explosive devices and landmines. The use of explosive weapons is significant because of the wide blast radius of explosives compared to other weapons, which can cause significant harm and damage when used in attacks. And we'll go on. Thank you. So we have at least 10 countries where attacks on education uniquely affect or target girls and women because of their gender. So for example, in countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan, we see female students and teachers, as well as the education facilities where they teach and learn, are targeted in an effort to prevent girls and women from accessing education. And finally, we've seen, oh, sorry, that's Ilaria's slide. So the last one is climate, where we've identified some preliminary connections. You can see this in the report, between climate insecurity and attacks on education. So for example, in the Central Sahel, which is affected by food insecurity, desertification, land degradation, as well as conflict. And these are all interlinking. And we've seen incidents, for example, where armed groups target school canteens and cafeterias for looting, for instance, in Burkina Faso. So thank you for listening to me. Those are the key findings and some of the trends, and I look forward to hearing everyone else and answering questions later. I'll hand over to Ilaria now to go through some of the key recommendations from the report.
Thank you, Felicity. So yes, indeed, the report does not only include the data, but it also includes recommendations, and here are some of the key ones that we wanted to share today, but there's more in the report that I encourage you to read. And also just to mention that it also includes some examples of positive change, let's say, or progress. So it also provides a sense of how some of these recommendations are taken seriously and implemented. And obviously, the first one is about seizing all attacks by all parties. The recommendations are really general and addressed to all parties to the conflict who undertake attacks, but they also target some specific stakeholders and duty bearers, in particular states, of course, who should endorse and implement the Safe School Declaration with a strong gender perspective and also intersectionality, as you heard, with data on indigenous groups and people with disabilities. So the importance, to really look at all vulnerabilities in when it comes to implementing the commitments that are in the Safe School Declaration, which is an intergovernmental agreement that has been developed back in 2015 under the leadership of Norway and Argentina, and that has become a global tool which is endorsed by 120 states as of today, with the latest one, Rwanda, who joined the Safe School Declaration around 10 days ago. One of the key commitments in the Safe School Declarations that states commit to undertake is to implement the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. The guidelines really are a very practical tool that aims to reducing and really support parties to refrain from using education facilities. And so these, although the Safe School Declaration can only be endorsed by states, the guideline can and should be implemented by all parties, including non-state armed groups. Another recommendation that we have is obviously about monitoring and reporting of attacks. We see that there's still progress to do. There's a high level of under-reporting and lack of access in many instances, which hampers the ability to actually have the real overview of the situation on the ground. We also recommend to commit to uphold obligations under international law about promptly and partially investigate all attacks on education and prosecute those responsible when relevant, and also develop comprehensive plans that take into account the risks and the motives as well, behind the attacks, to really understand why they're happening, try to mitigate as much as possible the consequences through appropriate protection measures. And finally, we wanted to seize the opportunity to really stress that it's attacks in education are a multidimensional issue, and so cross-sectoral approach is essential to be able to frame and address this in a proper way. So here the importance of these type of collaborations, which are super appreciated. And I'll stop here because I know we have taken a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilari and Felicity, for the overwhelming and staggering data that you've had access to and been able to analyze, and the recommendations that come from the report as well. I don't know that any of this really takes us by surprise, but certainly to see it at the macro level with the numbers is quite awesome in the true sense of awesome, meaning overwhelming, and really makes us pause and think about our role in addressing these, and appreciate the recommendations at the very end. ICRC is obviously tackling some of this, and I would welcome Mark now to begin his presentation on the role of ICRC and the work that they are doing. Mark?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you so much to Ilari and Felicity at GCPEA for that very sobering overview of their latest report. And yeah, I think the statistics speak for themselves, but the most worrying for me is the 20% increase we've seen, and that's on top of the increase we saw in the last report as well. So this is a trend which very sadly is growing. I'd like to talk to you today about the work that ICRC does to protect and ensure safe access to education in conflict and other situations of violence. Many of you may not associate ICRC with education, and we're not per se an education-focused organization, but we use our expertise in conflict, in humanitarian response, to bring that to bear to help address the humanitarian impact of conflict on education. Next slide, please. Firstly, a little kind of spot quiz. Feel free to drop something in the chat. As I said, many people don't think of ICRC as an education provider, but wondering if anyone out there can hazard a guess. Let us know why you think ICRC is addressing education issues. Any ideas? Anything? Feel free to write in the chat. Yes, because education is life-saving and life-enhancing. Any other thoughts? Thinking about ICRC's particular mandate, for those of you who know it, and thinking about who we're here to serve as well. Children's rights, very important. Yes, thank you, Gada. Yes, IHL, great to see that. And relation to protection, yes, excellent. Excellent. And education leads to peace and stability. There's some really good comments coming in there. Thank you. Next slide, please. So for ICRC, one of the main reasons why we formalized our response to addressing education needs is first and foremost responding to the needs of the affected population. We know from multiple pieces of research done over the last 10 years that children and families in particular will prioritize education in conflict and crisis. So it's a need that comes through from the people we work with. Secondly, and some of you mentioned this, the protection of education is enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, in International Humanitarian Law, and in the additional protocols, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. Another reason why we engage is that we believe we have some added value to the sector. And that mainly centers around our access to parties to conflict, to the people who are engaged in fighting or violence, and our access to affected areas that other agencies can't always access, like frontline areas or areas controlled by non-state armed groups. Finally, another reason behind our engagement in this area is the place in the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. So that's not just ICRC, that includes IFRC, the Federation, and the national societies in each country. So the Red Cross or Red Crescent Society in each of the countries where they're active. So this is the reason why we engage in this area. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we do that as well. Next slide, please. So our recently released report summarizes our approach, and it draws on our working experience over decades addressing humanitarian needs arising due to conflict and violence on education. I'll put a link to the report in the chat so you can see that at the end as well. But the report covers why is part of our response, which we just talked about, how we respond, how IHL relates to education, what we've learned so far, and our calls to states, donors, and practitioners. Next slide, please. So our global approach, and this aligns very much with the collaboration between INEE and the Alliance, we'll hear from Dean later. We recognize that education is a protective service. It protects the children we work with, but it also prevents their exposure to other risks. So as well as the positive elements of improving mental well-being, cognitive development, healthy development, it reduces the risk of abuse and exploitation. So that can include child labor and child marriage, and particularly for us, risks of sexual violence and child recruitment. As well as this, and some of you noted this in the chat, education systems allow delivery of other services. So they can be a vector for health services like immunization, for social services like child protection, for feeding programs, nutrition, school feeding, for water distribution, etc. So there's another reason to support education facilities in conflict and violence, because we can use that to get other humanitarian services to those most in need. And critically, and I saw this come through a lot in the chat, education provides hope, resilience, stability, and helps mitigate the risk of armed conflict and violence in the future. But it's important to note that ICRC is not a major education provider, and we only engage in protection of access to education where we can see that education is directly affected by armed conflict or violence. So for example, if we were working with a community that didn't have a school before a conflict, we wouldn't necessarily then build a school there or support a school there when conflict broke out. We also only engage when there are limited other actors that protect or restore access to education. So many other actors are on the call today who are very prominent in the education and emergency sector, would do a comprehensive job of addressing education needs. Where they're active, we leave it to them. And we also have some response to particular vulnerable groups under our protection approach, which I'll come to later. So it's worth noting also what we don't do. So ICRC, we kind of provide the circumstances where education can take place safely. So we protect education from attack in the first place where possible, and then we try to ensure that access to education is safe during conflict and violence. I'll explain how we do that. But what we don't do is deal with pedagogical concerns. We don't necessarily touch on the quality of education, curriculum development, training of teachers, etc. There's some small exemptions I'll talk about a little later, but we leave that to partners. So partnership is key for us when we're addressing education issues. Next slide, please. So before I talk about the breadth of the response elements that we look at, I just wanted to touch on how international humanitarian law supports the continuity of education and protects education. So I won't go through these in detail, but it's just to show that in the Geneva Conventions and in additional protocols, in international and non-international armed conflict, there are provisions which say education should be protected, Education should not be used for military purposes. Children must receive education. Children must receive respect and protection. Prisoners of war, people in internment, should also have opportunity for education and recreation. So all these elements are included in IHL, and as the custodian of IHL, we raise these with authorities, with armed forces, armed groups, to try and help them understand their obligations under IHL. Next slide, please. Also in IHL, protection against attack. We talked a little bit, we heard GCPEA talk a little bit about this. So fundamentally, IHL does protect schools, teachers and students against attack and armed conflict because they are civilian objects and civilians should be protected. So there's the presumption of protection. However, it's important to note, and this is where the Safe Schools Declaration goes further, there is no protection from direct attack if schools are turned into a military objective. So that is if schools are used by armed forces and armed groups, or even if they site their military installation close to schools, or if civilians in those schools and the communities participate in hostilities or become fighters. So this transforms it from a civilian object into a military object. Hence our work and the work that GCPEA do and their partners in trying to advocate that armed forces and armed groups do not use schools for military purposes, because then they become liable or vulnerable to attack. And throughout our discussions around IHL, we need to reference what we call the conduct of hostilities. So how conflict, how warfare takes place, and the principles behind that. And key principles around distinction, where military commanders need to be very clear and distinguish between military and civilian targets. They need to take precautions not to cause excessive damage to civilians, civilian infrastructure. And they need to weigh up the proportionality of the attack, whether or not the military outcomes and objectives are weighed up against the damage and the humanitarian consequences of the attack. So particularly with schools, the humanitarian consequences are greater than just destroying a civilian building, because they also destroy the opportunity for education for many children, not just then, but in the near and perhaps long-term future as well. Next slide, please. So what's our response? What do we do? And we split this into two kind of general areas. One is around protecting schools, so our protection work, and the other is around support or our assistance work that we give. And within protecting schools, our main added value to the education sector is around our dialogue with the parties to conflict. So the people who are taking part in the conflict, be that state armed groups or non-state armed groups, or other groups committing violence in communities. We engage with them and help them understand their obligations under IHL and other legal frameworks, not to attack schools and not to use schools for military purposes. And this, for us, almost protects schools from any danger, any damage, any attack in the first place if we're successful. And it reduces the overall humanitarian impact of conflict on education. And we have some really strong examples. The challenge for me is because of our confidentiality, I can't give a lot of specifics to this, but we've had examples where we've worked with non-state armed groups, and thanks to our intervention, they've issued declarations that protect education in their area of control. We've worked with military commanders on front lines and got them to move their military installations away from schools, reducing the risk of incidental attack. We also do passive security and risk management to help schools be better prepared for conflict and violence. And we do risk awareness and safer behavior training, which helps schools and communities understand the risks, plan for the risk and respond to them. And thanks to these interventions, we see that schools, education facilities stay open longer during conflict and violence, and open more quickly after incidences of violence, so children have more hours of learning. We then do what might be more familiar to NGOs, a kind of assistance type work, where there are no other actors who do this. That might include light rehabilitation and reconstruction of schools, reconnecting schools to utilities, so power and water, addressing financial barriers through direct distribution of materials or targeted cash distribution, increasing knowledge, skills, and resilience through our vocational and technical training programs. And then our focus on vulnerable groups, which I mentioned earlier. And this is where we work with specific groups under our mandate. So there might be children of the missing in warfare, children of prisoners of war. There might be children in our prosthetics and orthotics centres, or there might be children associated with armed groups who are reintegrating society. And these are small scale projects, but in each case, we would try to ensure they also access education as part of their overall humanitarian support. Next slide, please. So we've learned we do make a valuable contribution to the education emergency sector, although in small scale approaches, but these have strategic value. We bring transferable skills from our different departments that can support access to education. Our dialogue with parties to conflict really works. Partnership for us is key, either with ministries of education, other NGOs, or with the national societies in those contexts. And it's possible to support access to education in polarized contracts while remaining true to our core of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Next slide, please. So our call to donors, states, and other practitioners is to engage with us where you're working alongside us, implement and promote respect for IHL rules related to education, and also the Safe Schools Declaration, which goes above and beyond IHL, but we do support states to understand the legal implications of the Safe Schools Declaration and promote it in our dialogue with them. We call for addressing the education needs of frontline and marginalized communities, which perhaps are underserved, and to invest in preparedness and risk management to reduce disruption to education during conflict, so that plans and policies and resources are in place for emergency education. And finally, as many of you on the call know, without teachers, there's no education. So we need to strengthen protection of education staff in countries affected by armed conflict and violence. I'll put the link for the report in the chat, but also feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. But again, thank you for the opportunity and looking forward to your questions and conversation later.
Thank you so much, Mark, and such a wonderful opportunity to have an insight into ICRC's education work. I think you noted, and rightly so, that ICRC is not always perceived as an education actor in responses, but I think you've very clearly outlined the strategic nature as well as the very practical responses for individual children and schools. So thank you for that. And just a note to all of the participants, at the end of this webinar, we will be sharing out the recording along with links to all of the reports and resources that have been mentioned here. Great that we have the running sharing in the chat channel, but don't worry if you aren't accessing everything now. We will be compiling everything and sharing it out. Dean, I invite you now to share more about the joint initiative of INEE and the Alliance and build on the conversations that Ilaria, Felicity, and Mark have started on what we do with the information that has been shared through the Education Under Attack 2024 report.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Mark, and our colleagues at GCPEA. I'm happy to talk with you on behalf of both INEE and the Alliance for Child Protection. We can go to the next slide. So as you see there, it talks about our child protection and humanitarian action and education and emergencies initiative that started in 2020, but it actually started before that with a joint roundtable with the Alliance for Child Protection in Nairobi. Maybe many of you on this call were there back in 2018. You can see the outcome report, but that really launched, for me personally, what is a very important partnership with the Alliance for us to really guarantee the right to education we must work closely with our child protection colleagues. So this initiative brought together both networks. The Alliance really wanted to be here today, and they share their apologies, but they had another engagement, but they were happy to see that we're talking about this today. As you see in the slide, there are some very, I would say, foundational components of this partnership. And Mark, before he joined ICRC, was a key actor in helping us to pull all of this together with this position paper that you see back in 2021. And then later, during the COVID pandemic, a joint research initiative that really highlighted when schools were closed, that child protection risks increased, and schools should not be closed unless absolutely necessary. And I think that was actually a very important dimension of this partnership, that together we could advocate that schools remain open. We can go to the next slide. So why, these are some of the points. I think you all know why it's important, but we've outlined it here. So that we do know that integrating these two sectors does improve the well-being of children and young people, learners. It can improve learning outcomes, especially when it comes to mental health and psychosocial support, as well as family and community well-being. It also supports the access to education, reduces the leaving of school, and it also supports a child and student-centered approach when it comes to humanitarian response. It is effective, it prevents duplication, and it aligns with all of our discussions on the nexus, humanitarian development, coherence, and new ways of working. Go to the next slide. We really wanted to emphasize today the resources that have come out of this partnership, and in particular, this guidance note on supporting integrated child protection and education. Within this guidance note, and especially section 4, which is very relevant to today's discussion, you see that section has a real focus on safe access and protective learning. It is a resource that is very practical, asks key questions, and provides further resources that can help all of you in your work, your policy work, your response. I also wanted to emphasize the recently launched INEE minimum standards for education, preparedness, response, and recovery, which are a companion to the child protection minimum standards, all under the umbrella of the Humanitarian Standards Partnership. So the 2024 edition was launched last month. It is available, and I encourage all of you to take some time with the standards, where you will see child protection integrated throughout. This work with the Alliance and INEE is also connected closely to the Global Education Cluster and the Child Protection Area of Responsibilities Collaborative Framework, which also is important when we think about partnership and how we can support all of you. Another key outcome from this is not only this practical guidance, but an evidence of learning strategy, a theory of change, indicator framework, and we're continuing to work on joint advocacy. We can go to the next slide.
I don't think there's a next slide.
And there is no next slide, sorry. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, I looked at mine too. I was like, oh, there isn't the next slide. Just to say, again, how important this partnership is. And we are continuing to look at ways to build on this. Just yesterday, spoke with the Alliance, and I'm going to continue to work on the next steps on getting this guidance to you, and specifically how this work can be contextualized in new contexts. So thank you, and I think we have a few minutes for some comments. Back to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you, Dean. And just to answer questions coming into the chat channel, yes, we will be sending out an email with all of the resources that have been shared here, including the secondary resources mentioned in the presentation. So please look for that follow-on email. We have a number of questions come in, and some of them are directly looking to have a specific panelist respond. But I wanted to pick up on one question that has come in from several different participants, and that is how does the work outlined in all of the presentations consider and respond to situations of armed violence, even when it isn't declared a conflict? So we know that there are levels of conflict and parameters around declaring or understanding a formal declaration or existence of a conflict. How does the work of GCPEA reflect armed violence more broadly, if it does? And how does ICRC's work and the joint initiative under INEE and the Alliance reflect and respond to armed violence as well, if it does? And I would just ask that any of the presenters feel free to come off mute and respond to that.
I'll just start from GCPEA's side, from our sort of monitoring, reporting, and data collection. We do focus specifically on contexts of armed conflict. We have in previous reports had sections on violence in Latin America elsewhere, but broadly that's our mandate. We do monitor attacks globally, and we share global numbers of attacks, which also happen in contexts where there isn't an armed conflict, but armed violence or something else. But that's our mandate, and that's sort of where our data is focusing on.
Thank you, Felicity. Anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, from ICRC's perspective, we do work in other situations of violence. For example, in Colombia and Brazil, and there we use a kind of multidisciplinary approach, touching on what I've mentioned, where we might do some light rehabilitation in some of the communities that are most affected by violence. And then a big component is our working with them on the risk awareness and safer behavior training, so that communities understand the patterns of violence, the risks associated with violence, and they can develop response plans for their schools, for their communities. And in Brazil, we've really embedded this approach with the national and local authorities. And we've seen as a result of that schools are closing for less time when violence outbreaks, and opening more quickly after, and children are returning to school more quickly because they feel confident. They feel like they have a better understanding of the risk and how to respond to the risk. So relating to education, that's how we are kind of using our expertise in conflict, in risk management, in weapons contamination to address some of the issues in other situations of violence.
Thank you, Mark. Ilaria, I saw that you wanted to respond as well.
Yes, just very briefly to say that when it comes to advocacy and technical assistance, GCPEA works at global scale in all countries, I would say, because in all cases, the Safe School Declarations needs to be implemented by everyone and at all times, times of peace and times of conflict. There are many measures, legal policy, operational frameworks that need to be put in place that, of course, will prevent attacks from happening at the end of the day, even if a conflict, under international definition would be present or not. And I just want to mention, for example, that we are working together with the INEE, for example, in Latin America, engaging with states that currently do not have an armed conflict going on. But we're really trying to work together in implementation of the SSD together with the comprehensive safe school framework as well, and address more and more the linkages as well with climate change and all the contextual factors and aggravated risks that bring to the picture. So yeah, hope it replies to the question.
Great, thank you all. And just a note on the INEE and Alliance resources. All of our resources can be and should be used, picked up at any time, regardless of the level of conflict or other type of crisis, that we anticipate and expect that the minimum standards and the guidance note on supporting integrated CP and EIE programming is picked up during times of stability and quiet, to use in preparation or as a resource for anticipatory action or preparedness activities, as well as during the response and into recovery. But Dean, did you want to come in to answer any part of that final question?
Well, I think this is so important, the points raised today. I believe that continuing this partnership will be key, and working closely with both ICRC and GCPEA. And I think we have a lot to follow up on today in terms of sharing back all of these resources. So thank you.
And a very warm thank you to all of the presenters. It's been, within a very short period of time, quite dense but very practical points that have been raised through recommendations, but also examples provided. So thank you all for the presentations and the question and answer. We will be following up with each of you to answer a few more of the questions posed by participants during the webinar, and share those back to the participants at a later date. I want to echo what Dean says. I think this is not the first conversation. We've been engaged in many conversations with GCPEA and ICRC and INEE and the Alliance as well. But I do think that through this webinar, we're seeing a lot of appetite to pick up different points of the conversation, different types of information and how they might be reflected on and used to guide us to stronger programs and better protection for our learners and educators and the systems that serve them. So thank you all. It feels like we've just started a conversation, or we're in the middle of a conversation. We're certainly not at the end of the conversation, and we'll try to provide some additional opportunities to engage across all of the contexts that you're coming from and represent. So thank you all for the very dynamic, energizing chat streams as well. Really great to see the engagement there. But with that, I think we can end the webinar with again a thank you for all of the participants and a specific thank you to the presenters.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, and thanks to all the attendees.